Did civilization begin with us, or are we merely the inheritors of an extraordinary, perhaps terrifying memory? This is the silent question that echoes across the barren landscape of Mesopotamia, a place where time itself seems to be measured not in centuries, but in the slow, grinding erosion of forgotten epochs. When we speak of history, we usually begin with Sumer, the cradle where written language, urban planning, and codified law first took shape, seemingly erupting onto the scene fully formed, like Athena from the head of Zeus. Yet, what if Sumer was not a beginning, but a recovery? What if the earliest, most cryptic records scratched onto brittle clay tablets are not myths of creation, but rather meticulously preserved testimonies of a world that was utterly destroyed, a world existing before the Great Deluge, before the rupture of history we collectively call the Flood? We are trained to view the Flood narrative, the epic of a massive punitive cleansing of the planet, as a staple of theological tradition. It is found in Genesis, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in countless other cultures separated by vast oceans. But the Sumerian texts, the oldest written records known to humankind, treat this event with a different reverence. They describe it not as a moral allegory, but as a definitive historical marker, a catastrophic reset button that sliced reality into a before and an after. To understand what these texts reveal about the pre-flood world is to embark on an archaeological investigation that extends far beyond the physical strata of the earth, delving instead into the deepest, most unsettling layers of collective human consciousness. We are not just looking at lists of kings or economic transactions. We are deciphering the desperate effort of an entire civilization to save the knowledge, and perhaps the meaning, of their predecessors from the engulfing tides of oblivion. The sheer sophistication of early Sumer is the first unsettling clue. Their astronomical knowledge was complex, their mathematical system sexagesimal, precise, and their logistical capabilities immense, all appearing suddenly, without the lengthy periods of slow, incremental development we associate with human progress. This abrupt emergence hints strongly at an inheritance, a comprehensive data transfer from a source that had already mastered these disciplines. But where did this source originate? The Sumerian scribes themselves pointed backward, always backward, to a time governed by forces that were profoundly non-human, an era of impossible longevity and direct interaction between the terrestrial and the celestial. This realization, that the foundation of our civilization rests upon a deliberate acknowledgement of beings and events preceding recorded human history, is where the comfort of familiar history begins to crumble, and the true investigation must start. As we delve into these deep layers of clay and language, the journey requires not only intellectual curiosity, but also a willingness to confront ideas that challenge the established timeline of human endeavor. This is a subtle expedition, demanding attention to nuance and the patience to hold seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. If this investigation into the profound heritage preserved by the Sumerians resonates with the quiet questions you have carried about our true origins, then consider pausing with us for a moment. To truly grasp the scope of what these ancient witnesses attempted to communicate, we must approach these texts with focus, allowing their weight to settle upon our modern understanding. If you find value in this pursuit of hidden knowledge, share your initial thoughts below. What single question most drives your search into the deep past? Your engagement extends this intellectual journey, anchoring the collective search for the truth of the antediluvian age. It is in the famed Sumerian king list that the first explicit shock resides. This document, crucial to understanding Mesopotamian chronology, meticulously records the reigns of kings. But the list is fundamentally bifurcated by a single catastrophic line. The flood swept over, and after the flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven a second time. Crucially, the reigns of the kings before the flood are not measured in decades or even centuries, but in sars, periods ranging from 18,000 to nearly 50,000 years. Elulim ruled for 28,800 years, Alangar for 36,000 years. 8 kings reigned for a total of 241 years. These are not human lifetimes as we understand them. They exist outside the boundaries of human experience, demanding that we consider two possibilities. Either these figures are purely mythological, intended only to establish antiquity and divine authority, or they represent something entirely different, a civilization ruled by beings whose lifespan or concept of time was radically alien to our own post-diluvian reality. The abrupt, terrifying contraction of lifespans immediately after the flood serves only to underscore the profound discontinuity. This narrative thread of impossible duration is picked up and elaborated upon in the Eridu Genesis, often cited as the oldest known text to recount the flood story. Here we encounter the explicit concept of kingship being lowered from heaven to the city of Eridu. This kingship was not an organic human development, but a gift, or perhaps an imposition, bestowed upon humanity by superior entities. The texts meticulously list the 5 cities where this pre-flood kingship was centered: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, before the waters consumed them. These cities are thus not merely ancient ruins. They are the ghost libraries of the antediluvian world. What truly fascinates is the implication that the rulers during this immense span were not merely powerful mortals, but perhaps the intermediaries or direct agents of those superior entities, often referenced later in the Akkadian literature as the Anunnaki. The term Anunnaki itself, loosely translating to princely offspring, or those who from heaven to earth came, hints at the identity of these long-reigning kings. They were the observers, those who descended to establish order, to impart the foundational knowledge of geometry, agriculture, and construction to early humanity, all before the inevitable cataclysm. These texts suggest that humanity lived in a state of controlled dependency, receiving complex civilization as a structured inheritance rather than forging it slowly through evolutionary struggle. If the kings ruled for millennia, it was perhaps because they were not truly kings in our sense, but long-cycling administrators maintaining a complex system designed to monitor and cultivate the early stages of our species. It forces the unsettling question: what were they observing, and why did they deem it necessary to record the precise lineage of their presence? The careful record-keeping suggests not folklore, but archival diligence. The inherent burden carried by the post-flood scribes becomes evident when examining their relentless focus on the preservation of Mies, the divine decrees or essential civilization patterns. These Mies represented the full inventory of skills, laws, and knowledge necessary for organized society. They were supposedly carried off or rescued by the various deities before the flood, only to be reclaimed and re-established by the new post-diluvian kings. This detail reveals a profound cultural awareness that their knowledge was a direct, stolen, or gifted inheritance from the world that was lost. The struggle of the Sumerians was thus the struggle against the ultimate forgetting, a battle against the entropy of time and the vast destructive power of the flood, the Great Rupture. It was a conscious effort to rebuild, not from scratch, but by carefully reassembling the fragmented blueprint left behind by the civilization of impossibly long-lived rulers. The story of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, is central to this concept of preservation. Unlike the figure in later traditions, Ziusudra is often portrayed less as a random righteous man and more as an initiate, one who was secretly informed of the coming disaster by the water god Enki. He was tasked not only with survival but with the conservation of the seeds of life. This narrative serves as the ultimate testament to the transition of the Mies. The knowledge itself was physically saved, sealed away in the ark, ready to be reintroduced to the terrified, fragmented survivors on the mud banks of the newly formed world. Ziusudra became the pivotal link, the human bridge between the cosmic timeline of the antediluvian gods and the brief, desperate timeline of post-diluvian man. He carried the full weight of the memory of what was, acting as the living library of the forgotten world. Even the linguistic structure carries the whispers of the advanced heritage. The Sumerian language, agglutinative and distinct, contains terms that hint at profound cosmological and technological concepts, ideas that seem far too sophisticated for a civilization supposedly inventing the wheel and the plow simultaneously. The frequent, reverent references to celestial mechanics, the movement of the stars, and the precise mathematical requirements for the construction of their ziggurats suggest a scientific legacy that transcends mere observation. Could it be that the language itself, gifted by the Anunnaki, contains embedded clues regarding the nature of their own origins and the mechanisms of their advanced culture? The possibility is deeply intriguing, that the Sumerians inherited not just kingship, but a coded vocabulary designed to keep the memory of their advanced predecessors alive. This foundational work, examining the king lists, the Eridu Genesis, and the structure of Sumerian memory, establishes an undeniable framework. The Sumerians believed that a civilization of immense antiquity and radically different physical laws existed before the flood. The evidence suggests it was an age marked by superhuman longevity, direct governance from heaven, and the bestowal of highly sophisticated knowledge upon humanity. But establishing the existence of this antediluvian world is only the first phase of our investigation. The crucial step now is to move beyond the chronology of the kings and begin to piece together the actual nature of that pre-flood reality. What did they build? What were their ultimate goals? Why did the superior beings initiate the flood, and why did they save Ziusudra? We must now turn our attention to the specific detailed accounts of the cities themselves, the architecture, the daily lives, and the technologies hinted at in the obscure corners of the vast Sumerian corpus. If you have followed this journey thus far, you possess the patience and intellectual curiosity required to probe deeper into this great mystery. This is a collaborative effort to reread history, so if you haven't already done so, joining this channel by subscribing and leaving a reflective like ensures you receive the next crucial part of this unfolding discovery. The memory of the Anunnaki and the cycles of forgetting are potent forces, and we must remain vigilant in our search. In our next exploration, we will focus directly on the physical descriptions and the hinted technological marvels of the pre-flood cities themselves, the places that were first touched by the kingship lowered from heaven. What secrets are buried beneath the sands of Eridu and Shuruppak? The investigation into the world before the Great Deluge continues. What if the deepest shadows we cast today are merely the echoes of a sun that set long ago? A sun that illuminated a civilization we have systematically trained ourselves to forget. The clay tablets of Sumer, these brittle windows into an impossible past, do not simply offer us historical data. They impose upon us a profound cognitive dissonance. When we peer into the text describing the world before the Great Flood, we are forced to confront not just the ancient past, but the very limits of our modern understanding of history, time, and human potential. We read the names of cities, the accounts of rituals, the meticulous record-keeping of grain and livestock, and yet, interwoven into this mundane administrative reality, lies a narrative thread so impossibly vast it seems to defy physics and biology. This is the first and most immediate point of strangeness. The Sumerians treated the unbelievable as fact, cataloging the extraordinary alongside the completely ordinary. They speak of a time when the kings, the rulers anointed by the divine assembly, measured their reigns not in decades or even centuries, but in units of time so immense they feel alien to the human scale. We are used to treating these numbers, 28,800 years for the first king of Eridu, or 43,200 years for another, as poetic exaggeration, as mythical inflation designed to bolster dynastic legitimacy. But what if that is merely our modern defensive mechanism, our way of walling off inconvenient data that threatens the neat, stratified timeline of human development we have constructed? The Sumerians, meticulous accountants and builders that they were, seem to possess a different frame of reference entirely. They were chronicling a period of existence that suggests either an unimaginable biological longevity or a vastly different perception of rulership, perhaps involving sequential generations occupying a singular divine office for eons. The fact that the list abruptly shifts, immediately after the devastating marker of the flood, to reigns measured in conventional, recognizable human years, a mere handful of decades, serves as a chilling confirmation. The catastrophic interruption was not just geographical, it was temporal. It compressed the existence of mankind, resetting the clock and fundamentally altering the relationship between the ruler and the passage of time. To ignore this radical discontinuity is to miss the central revelation hidden within the clay. We must pause here, in the quiet contemplation of these impossible numbers, and consider, if the texts hold such profound, precise details about mundane life, why should we arbitrarily dismiss the scale of time they describe, simply because it makes us uneasy? If this unfolding realization is sparking an unusual resonance within you, a curiosity that demands resolution, I encourage you to pause your activities, focus intensely on the narrative we are weaving together, and consider supporting, this deep dive investigation by liking this video and subscribing. It ensures that the algorithm recognizes the importance of these lost signals and helps us continue to excavate the truth from the sands of historical oblivion. As we delve deeper into this structure of time, we begin to recognize a pattern that moves beyond simple linear progression. The Sumerian cosmological view, subtly woven throughout their creation epics and ritual calendars, speaks less of a continuous upward march of progress and more of cycles. The world was not created once and for all. Rather, it was established, maintained, disrupted, and re-established. This cyclical framework suggests the Ata-Abu, the deluge, was not a freak accident, but a predictable, almost bureaucratic necessity within a much larger cosmic timetable. The pre-diluvian world, therefore, was merely the apex of the previous cycle. This throws into sharp relief the nature of the beings who established this structure, the Anunnaki. They are introduced not as ethereal spirits or abstract concepts, but as physical entities who descended from the heavens to earth. Their presence is inextricably linked to the transference of me, the fundamental principles of civilization, knowledge, and divine ordinances. These me were the operating system for the world before the flood, a comprehensive knowledge base encompassing everything from weaving to warfare, from kingship to musical instruments. The texts strongly imply that the civilization flourishing before the flood was essentially a direct implementation of the Anunnaki's design. This explains the advanced, yet abruptly discontinued nature of their earliest urban centers, particularly Eridu, the first city established by the divine decree. We are left with the distinct impression that the inhabitants of this primordial world were observers and custodians of a magnificent, inherited wisdom rather than its originators. Their architecture, their astronomy, and their deeply sophisticated understanding of water management systems all speak to a legacy that arrived fully formed, already optimized for a specific, immense purpose. The sheer scale of the engineering efforts described, often involving the repositioning of colossal stones and the development of intricate irrigation channels across vast distances, hints at technologies far removed from the simple copper and bronze tools we typically associate with this period. The pre-flood world, in this context, becomes less a primitive past and more a highly specialized outpost, operating under the direct supervision of the observers, those Anunnaki, who monitored their colossal experiment. This uneasy recognition of external intervention forces us to reconsider the concept of the gods. They were not beings to be passively worshipped from afar. They were the architects, the project managers, sometimes even the laborers. The texts depict them engaged in disputes over territory, requiring food and drink, becoming weary from their labors, and utilizing vehicles or methods of transit that sound suspiciously like flying craft. They possessed a materiality that is often overlooked in modern, sanitized interpretations. This proximity, this tangible interaction between the super-long-lived Anunnaki and the shorter-lived human population defines the pre-flood reality. It was a world of direct accountability, where the rules of civilization were literally handed down, codified, and enforced by the very beings who had engineered the environment. Then came the discontinuity. The tablets are unequivocal about the event that destroyed that world. The great washing away, the total submersion. The shift in tone after the flood references is palpable. The grand scale shrinks. The reigns are shorter. The relationship between humanity and the divine becomes strained, mediated by priests and temples rather than direct daily interaction. The few survivors, figureheads like Ziusudra in the Sumerian account or Utnapishtim in the later Akkadian versions, carried the staggering burden of memory. They knew what was possible, and they knew the speed with which everything could be undone. They were the keepers of the fragmented inheritance, tasked with restarting civilization from ruins, but with the terrifying knowledge of the cosmic timetable imprinted on their minds. The knowledge that they saved, the plans for the Ark, the seed of all living things, and critically, the preserved texts, was not merely historical data. It was a survival manual for the next inevitable cycle. It is in this post-diluvian anxiety that we find the most haunting realization. The Sumerian emphasis on meticulous record-keeping, the relentless obsession with foundations, boundaries, and measurements might not have been merely for practical governance. It was preparation. It was an attempt to encode the lost signal, the heritage of the Anunnaki. into the very bedrock of the new civilization, ensuring that the knowledge would persist, regardless of how many centuries passed before the cycle inevitably began its slow, unsettling return. The lingering question remains: what crucial piece of engineering or astronomical knowledge, encoded within the colossal lifespans and the descriptions of the pre-flood world, were they trying to signal across the millennia to us? What secret were the survivors of the deluge desperate for us to retrieve before the next great upheaval arrives? If you have stayed with us on this journey into the most challenging depths of ancient history, if you feel that creeping recognition that perhaps our official timeline is incomplete or fundamentally flawed, then you belong here. We are only just beginning to decode the full implications of the Sumerian inheritance. To continue receiving these deep dive explorations and to join this community of intellectual pioneers, please take a moment to subscribe and signal your support by liking this video. Most importantly, I invite you to share your deepest thoughts on this subject in the comments below. Tell us, what specific knowledge do you believe the survivors tried to encode in the texts? Your participation fuels this ongoing investigation. Now, as we prepare to examine the specific function and purpose of the me and the strange technological relics hinted at in the pre-flood narrative, we must prepare ourselves for the most startling revelation of all: the precise, unsettling connection between these ancient cycles and the astronomical observations that dictate our own current era. Click the video on your screen now to join us as we step further into the shadows and retrieve the next vital piece of the signal. What if the truest indication of a forgotten civilization is not the monumental ruin, but the unsettling measure of time etched onto the earliest surviving memory? We are conditioned to view history through the lens of our own brief, flickering lifespans, 100 years marking a formidable milestone. But when we turn our gaze toward the clay tablets of Sumer, toward the legendary list of kings who ruled before the Great Deluge, we are instantly thrown into an abyss of chronological impossibility, forcing us to question the very fabric of reality as understood by the first organized societies. The Sumerian king list, perhaps the most iconic vestige of this antediluvian world, details monarchs whose reigns were measured not in decades or centuries, but in czars' cycles equating potentially to thousands of years. We speak of Alulim, the first king of Eridu, who ruled for 800 years, or Enmenluana of Bad Tabira, who purportedly held the throne for 43,200 years. These figures are astronomically dissonant to our modern historical sense, yet they are recorded with the same matter-of-fact certainty as the later, historically verified kings. This is the first great intellectual shock delivered by the Sumerian texts. They insist that a prior epoch existed where beings, whether they were fully human, semi-divine, or something entirely alien to our current biological constraints, operated on a timescale that defied terrestrial biology. This unsettling longevity is the core difference between the world we know and the world that was submerged. It suggests a civilization managed by entities for whom the building of monuments, the planning of infrastructure, and the development of knowledge were activities spanning epochs rather than generations. A person whose reign lasts for 40 millennia is not merely a king, they are a living institution, a repository of generational knowledge, an uninterrupted link to the very origin of their governance. They were observers in the truest sense, overseeing cosmic cycles and shifts that modern humanity barely acknowledges. The vast gulf of time implied by these numbers is not an error in translation or calculation. It is a profound declaration by the Sumerians themselves that their foundational era was fundamentally different, governed by rules of existence we no longer inhabit or perhaps can no longer endure. The weight of this forgotten timeline is immense, and if you feel the deep resonance of this historical strangeness, if you recognize the crucial importance of recovering these submerged narratives, then perhaps we share the same quest for illumination. Taking a moment to signal that recognition, by liking this journey and subscribing to ensure we continue this deep dive, is how we ensure that the faint light of these ancient truths remains visible against the darkness of intentional forgetting. The records also reveal a critical, almost formal process for the establishment of this early order. The tablets state unequivocally that kingship descended from heaven. This phrase is not a mere poetic flourish. It is a historical marker. It denotes a specific event, the initiation of governance on earth, and implies that the authority, the methodology, and perhaps the very genetics of these first rulers were extrinsic to the local terrestrial population. It's a moment of recognition, a historical inflection point where the celestial intersected with the terrestrial, establishing Eridu, the first city, not just as a settlement, but as the initial staging ground for a deliberate governmental structure. Eridu, often revered as the most ancient of cities, was therefore more than just mud brick walls and temples. It was the designated node, the anchor point where the immense longevity of the first kings could be properly utilized. It was the administrative hub, the place where the Mi were initially received and cataloged. The Mi, a concept utterly central to understanding the antediluvian world, are described in Sumerian mythology as the divine decrees, or the fundamental templates that govern all aspects of civilized life, from high priestly office and jurisprudence down to mundane acts like weaving and music. If the kings were the administrators of the antediluvian world, the Mians were the blueprint they meticulously followed. They were the operating system, the code of civilization handed down from the primary deities, suggesting a world not allowed to evolve randomly, but structured according to a pre-existing, highly sophisticated plan. The transfer of the Mi, famously detailed in the myth of Inanna and Enki, underscores the idea that civilization itself was not organically invented by early man, but rather bestowed upon him, a technological and sociological inheritance from those original observers, the Anunnaki. This reliance on a divine, immutable template speaks volumes about the societal stability and the lack of innovation required in that epoch. Why invent if the perfect, divinely ordained template already exists? This sense of structured perfection, however, carries with it an undercurrent of unease. Perfection is static, and the texts hint at a tension between the imposed structure and the potential for terrestrial change. Yet, despite the meticulous record-keeping implied by the Mi and the extreme stability conferred by immortal or near-immortal rulers, the surviving record remains agonizingly fragmented. There is an intentional silence surrounding the true origins of the beings who held the kingship and the full extent of the technologies they possessed. It is as if a historical eraser was deployed across the epoch, leaving only the barest census of rulers and their unbelievable durations, forcing us to grapple with the possibility of a profound, systematic erasure of memory. Why would a civilization so organized fail to leave a more complete account of its daily life? Was the destruction of the deluge so complete that it physically shattered all records? Or was the memory of the pre-flood world actively suppressed or restricted to an esoteric priesthood following the catastrophe? This is where the inquietusome deepens, as we realize that the gaps in the clay tablets are perhaps as revealing as the words inscribed upon them. The scale of time revealed in the king list also allows us to recognize a deep-seated Sumerian preoccupation with cycles, a concept mirrored in nearly every great world mythology. The reigns of the antediluvian kings represent the first grand cycle, a golden age characterized by extreme closeness between the divine and the terrestrial. This epoch did not merely end. It was terminated violently, reset by water, only to begin a new, diminished cycle where reigns were shorter and the gods were more distant. This cyclical view of time suggests that the Great Deluge was not a random natural disaster, but perhaps a necessary punctuation mark, a massive epical recalibration of earthly conditions, perhaps initiated or overseen by the very beings who had established the initial governance. To rule for thousands of years means that the concerns of your civilization are not short-term gain, but planetary stewardship and the deep maintenance of cosmic order. The longevity of these rulers wasn't a biological quirk. It was likely a societal necessity for managing a civilization whose existence spanned multiple precessional cycles. Imagine the societal norms when leadership remains constant for millennia. Change would be glacial, and the accumulation of esoteric knowledge of astronomy, geology, and global interconnectedness would have reached an unfathomable peak. This realization shifts our perception. We are not just looking at a legend of long-lived rulers, but at the structure of an entirely different kind of society, one built on continuity rather than turnover, a society perhaps inherently resistant to the rapid, disruptive chaos we recognize as modernity. But even this immensely stable system carried the signs of its own impending doom, subtle signals perhaps only recognizable to those operating on such extended timescales. The texts, when read with a certain recognition, subtly hint at a growing tension. a celestial decree whispered among the high ranks of the observers. The revelation is gradual. The very reason for the king's descent, to establish order, contained the seeds of their withdrawal. The purpose was finite. The perfection of the me could not hold forever against the forces of decay or cosmic change, and the Sumerian narratives suggest that the observers, the Anunnaki, began to detect the sign, a coming disruption that would necessitate the complete liquidation of the established terrestrial order. We must look closely now at the moments leading up to the Great Break, at the subtle political shifts mentioned between the cities just before the final reign. There is an intellectual shift required here, moving from mere cataloging of kings to understanding their actions as predictive markers of an unavoidable end. The final moments of the antediluvian world are shrouded in urgency and fear, centering around the figure who would become the pivot between the two epochs, Ziusudra. The question now ceases to be who these kings were, but what critical knowledge they possessed about the coming destruction, and precisely how that knowledge was secretly and selectively transmitted to ensure a small fragment of the me survived the catastrophic reset. This transition, the moment the observers decided to withdraw the hand of perfect governance and allow the destructive cycle to complete, is precisely where our investigation must turn next, requiring us to examine the singular, vital dialogue that preceded the Great Flood. If you have stayed with this dense, winding path through the unsettling longevity and the codified perfection of the antediluvian world, you are part of a very small, discerning group willing to examine the deep history often dismissed as mere myth. If this quest for forgotten truths resonates with you, I invite you to join our growing community of observers by subscribing to the channel. Please give this video a like if you found the discussion of the me and the concept of epical longevity thought-provoking. And to mark your presence, comment below with the phrase, "The weight of the Tsar." We are now poised at the threshold of the flood narrative itself, ready to analyze the intimate communication between the god Enki and the last antediluvian king, Ziusudra. That conversation, recorded on fragile clay, is the key to understanding the mechanism of the catastrophe and the true intentions of those who reigned before the water came. Join us in the next part as we decode the secret instructions given to the Sumerian Noah. What if the most profound discovery is not about finding something new, but recognizing something impossibly old, something that fundamentally shifts the axis of history? We have navigated the initial shock of the antediluvian kings, those figures whose reigns were measured not in decades or centuries, but in vast, unsettling spans of millennia. But the sheer duration of their existence is perhaps less revealing than the quality of the world they inhabited, a world preserved for us in fragments of baked clay, whispering of an inherent complexity that defies the linear narrative of primitive origins. How did the earliest recognizable human societies possess a geometrical and astronomical understanding so refined that it seems to bypass the essential steps of slow, painful, incremental discovery? The Sumerian texts, when studied not just for their mythological content but as historical records imbued with scientific data, present a sudden, almost fully formed civilization, a structure of knowledge that appears to have been given, not earned. We speak of the origins of mathematics, yet the sexagesimal system, the root of timekeeping and celestial calculation, emerges in Sumer with an already mature sophistication. It is as if the builders of Eridu were working from an established cosmic blueprint, a high-order calculus provided by the observers, the Anunnaki, who descended from the heavens. This leads us into the heart of the strangeness. The technology and knowledge required to track the precession of the equinoxes, to chart planetary cycles with breathtaking accuracy, should require generations of painstaking observation and the development of specialized instruments. Yet, the literature suggests this knowledge was simply present, a foundational layer upon which the antediluvian cities were constructed. The unease settles when we recognize the disparity. A society that fundamentally relied on baked mud bricks and simple agricultural practices simultaneously possessed an intellectual key to the very mechanisms of the cosmos. This juxtaposition, primitive physicality coupled with advanced metaphysical and mathematical insight, is the first true signal that something is fundamentally outside the conventional historical framework. If you are following this thread of unsettling recognition, if the depth of this ancient mystery resonates with a hidden awareness within you, I encourage you to pause for a moment and allow this weight of inherited memory to settle. History is often the narrative of the victor, or in this case, the narrative of the survivor. But the Sumerian texts are the echo of the lost. To fully grasp what we are uncovering about the world before the Great Flood, it is crucial that we share this journey of deep reflection. Engaging with this material requires focused attention, the willingness to reconsider established paradigms. If you find value in this pursuit of hidden knowledge, letting us know through a like and subscribing to the channel helps ensure these deeper, more complex investigations can continue to be brought to light. Your input and shared reflections in the comments below, perhaps focusing on the concept of inherited knowledge, become an extension of this very investigation. The architecture of these earliest cities, such as Bad Tibera, the second city to hold kingship before the deluge, is described with a sense of deliberate grandeur, a formal rigidity unlike the organic growth of later settlements. They were places designed not merely for living, but perhaps for observing. They were anchors for immense timelines. But there is a disturbing isolation inherent in the narrative describing the relationship between the high ruling class, the Anunnaki, and the populace. These higher beings, who administered justice, granted the technologies of civilization, and maintained the strict codes of their engineered society, appear to have remained fundamentally separate. The immense lifespans of the antediluvian kings were not merely biological anomalies. They served a functional purpose: to maintain continuity and prevent the critical knowledge base from decaying over vast stretches of time, essentially buffering against the societal forgetting that is endemic to mortal, short-lived humans. The Sumerian king list, therefore, becomes not just a chronology, but a blueprint for stability under extreme duress of time, a method designed to preserve the initial instructions until the predicted cyclical catastrophe occurred. This leads us to the missing link in the chain, the explicit cause of the flood. While later texts, particularly those emerging from Babylonian and Hebrew traditions, simplify the event to divine moral dissatisfaction, the Sumerian records hint at something more intrinsic to the cosmos itself. There is a strong undertone suggesting that the catastrophe was not a random act of spite, but perhaps a predictable massive recalibration, the culmination of the great cycles. The Anunnaki, themselves tied to the movement of celestial bodies and potentially arriving here due to specific orbital alignments, may have possessed the mathematical models to predict a devastating planetary event. The unsettling revelation here is that the creation of humanity and the founding of these cities might have occurred during a temporary period of planetary stability, a calculated interlude between cosmic resets. If this is true, the antediluvian civilization was built with a predetermined, non-negotiable expiration date, known only to its highest administrators. We begin to recognize the true depth of the historical anxiety embedded within these early tablets. The unease grows from the recognition that the forgetting was perhaps intentional, or at least a necessary consequence of the event. The deluge didn't just wipe out life, it wiped out the memory of the sheer scale of the operation that preceded it. The few survivors, finding themselves in a radically altered world, a world stripped of the vast temporal continuity afforded by the long-lived rulers, could only retain fragments, mythological echoes of the true cosmic geometry that had governed their ancestors. The subsequent human civilizations, struggling to rebuild after such absolute devastation, inherited scraps of knowledge, astronomy without the full context, measurement systems without the divine rationale, and rituals whose original purpose had become obscured by profound tragedy. Think of the burden carried by the few who survived, those tasked with restarting civilization. They faced an immense chasm in history. The vast reigns of the pre-flood kings, such as Enmenluana of Bad Tibera, who ruled for 43,200 years, suddenly collapsed into the short, fragile lifespans of post-flood kings. This radical shortening of the lifespan is not merely biological fate. It represents the loss of historical depth, the shattering of institutional memory. The New World, the world of Kish and Uruk, was a pale imitation, a necessary amnesia enacted for the sake of survival. The subtle power of the Sumerian king list is not its historical accuracy in the conventional sense, but its function as a memorial, a defiant declaration that such vast timescales were once real, and that the knowledge of the cosmos was once complete. This persistent echo, this whisper of the forgotten covenant, suggests a contract between the creators and the created that was irrevocably broken by the flood itself. Was the covenant that humanity would act as stewards of this unique knowledge? Or was the covenant merely temporal, to exist and serve until the sign of the cosmic return was observed? The texts remain infuriatingly vague on the specifics of the moral code, but they are clear on the sign: a specific devastating ingress of water, a complete planetary cleansing that the observers knew was coming. The very structure of the Sumerian narrative, placing the flood as the absolute demarcation point, forces us to confront the idea that the world we inhabit, the current version of civilization, is inherently diminished, functioning with residual fragments of a lost grandeur. We are living in the post-apocalyptic era of a vastly superior predecessor. The profound sense of displacement inherent in studying the fragments of this lost civilization is what keeps pulling us back to the clay tablets. We search for the instructions, the specific formulas of the advanced architecture and astronomical predictions that must have been recorded before the cleansing. The Anunnaki are repeatedly described as descending, observing, and governing, but the texts also convey a sense of their eventual planned withdrawal, long before the waters rose. They were custodians, perhaps, administering a highly sophisticated but temporary biological experiment. If the flood was a predictable celestial event, then the crucial question shifts from why they sent the flood to why they didn't take greater measures to save their entire creation. The possibility remains that humanity, despite the efforts of figures like Ziusudra, was fundamentally disposable in the grand calculation of the great cycles. This chilling realization that the world before the flood operated under rules and dimensions entirely alien to our own, based on colossal timeframes and predetermined catastrophes, brings us to the edge of a significant intellectual precipice. We are about to delve into the specific mechanisms of their departure and the lasting heritages they left behind, the true meaning of the objects and temples they instructed humanity to build. We must consider the possibility that these structures were not merely places of worship, but sophisticated time markers, signal beacons left behind for a planned future inspection. The ancient texts do not end with the catastrophe. They pivot towards the future, suggesting a profound connection between the initial appearance of the observers and a subtle sign of return. It is here, in the geometry of the structures left standing after the waters receded, that we might find the most disturbing clue of all. The story is far from over. If you have stayed with us through this dense investigation, recognizing the inherent complexities and the potential for lost knowledge contained within the Sumerian tablets, you are now part of a dedicated community seeking the truth beyond the surface narrative. This pursuit requires tenacity and a serious commitment to deep history. If the unfolding of this mystery resonates with your own sense of historical displacement, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on this video. Your engagement is the essential fuel for these extended explorations into the forgotten past. We are not just recounting history, we are decoding a message left for those who pay attention. We invite you to comment below with the phrase, "the burden of the long lifetimes," to signify your understanding of the staggering temporal scale we are investigating. Do not miss the next part of this 9-part series, which will appear on your screen shortly, where we examine the specific geometry of the post-flood temples and what they reveal about the eventual return of the observers. The horizon of inquiry is upon us, and the signals are starting to coalesce. What if the most profound mystery of our past is not what was built, but what was deliberately left out? We stand at the precipice of recorded history, examining the earliest known civilizations, Sumer, and are immediately confronted not by slow, arduous progression, but by an instantaneous leap. The cuneiform tablets speak eloquently of kings and laws, astronomy and mathematics, complex agriculture and monumental architecture, but they skip the crucial step: the transition from scattered hunter-gatherers to sophisticated city-states. It is the silence in the historical record, that gaping chasm between the alleged primitive past and the towering, fully formed civilization of Sumer, that screams of an imposed knowledge, a civilization initialized rather than evolved. We are forced to confront the unnerving possibility that the first recorded societies did not discover these tenets of order, but rather inherited them, dusted off from the ruins of the world that preceded the catastrophic deluge. This inheritance, detailed meticulously in the king lists and various creation narratives, paints a picture of a world that understood physics and celestial mechanics to a degree that we ourselves have only recaptured in the last few centuries. Yet, after the waters receded, why did humanity struggle so fiercely with the most basic tools of survival? This leads us into a deep state of estrangement, a cognitive dissonance where the evidence simply does not align with the linear model of human development taught in conventional history. We read the names of the antediluvian kings, Alulim, Alalgar, and Menluana, and are told they ruled for periods stretching into the thousands of years. Were these figures merely symbolic exaggerations, placeholders for epochs of time, or did they represent a biological and chronological reality fundamentally different from our own? If they were physical beings, their longevity suggests either a dramatically different environment, perhaps protected by a dense atmospheric canopy that was shattered by the flood event, or an entirely separate genetic lineage, a progenitor race whose lifespan and capabilities dwarfed those of the post-diluvian. Human. The Sumerian texts, rather than offering clarity, deepen the complexity by emphasizing the gifts these beings bestowed. They did not simply teach fishing or farming. They imparted the knowledge of writing, metallurgy, and the precise observation of the heavens, tools far too advanced for a species allegedly starting from zero. This rapid initialization feels less like natural evolution and more like the deployment of a carefully curated starter kit, hinting at a higher external intelligence that managed the transition, perhaps less concerned with human spirituality and more preoccupied with maintaining certain fundamental knowledge systems. We begin to recognize the unsettling pattern. The pre-flood world was not just lost, it was actively quarantined from the survivors, ensuring that the knowledge that might have led to a repeat of the Great Cataclysm was tightly controlled or, better yet, systematically forgotten. It is here, in the analysis of the inherited structure of Sumerian society, that we uncover the concept of cosmic timing and perpetual cycles. The flood in the Sumerian account is often presented not as a unique divine punishment, but as a mechanism of global reset, a predictable event linked to the movements of celestial bodies or the frustration of the ruling class of celestial beings, the Anunnaki. This recognition of cycles is deeply embedded in their astronomy, which mapped the precession of the equinoxes with striking accuracy. Why would a fledgling civilization be so obsessed with these vast, slow-moving cosmic clocks, unless that timing held profound existential importance? The answer lies in the implication that the Anunnaki themselves operate on a cyclical schedule. They arrive, they organize, they accelerate development, they reset, and they wait. The texts speak of a great forgetting, a cloud of collective amnesia that descended upon the survivors of the flood, leaving them bewildered and struggling. This imposed stasis, this sudden inability to access the higher knowledge of their ancestors, strongly suggests that the overseeing entities desired a fresh start, perhaps fearing that the previous civilization had reached a level of technological hubris that threatened their own dominion, or worse, threatened the integrity of the planet itself. The unease settles in when we realize that if a cycle completed once, it is destined, by their own design, to complete again. This persistent sense of management brings us directly to the identity of the Watchers, or the Igigi, often associated with the Anunnaki, but sometimes described as a subordinate group stationed closer to Earth, tasked with the physical labor and direct oversight of humanity before the flood. Their motivations, as gleaned from the creation myths and epics like Atrahasis, seem intensely pragmatic. They demanded labor, not necessarily worship in the moralistic sense. The initial creation of humanity appears to be a solution to a labor crisis faced by these advanced beings. If we view them less as gods imbued with perfect morality and more as highly advanced, non-terrestrial managers, the context shifts entirely. Their actions, the creation, the subsequent flooding, the selection of Ziusudra, Utnapishtim as a survivor, are administrative functions aimed at resource management and conflict resolution. This realization is profoundly unsettling. The world before the flood, the one they governed, was perhaps not a golden age of freedom, but a highly structured, heavily managed domain. where human potential was accelerated only to the point necessary to serve the needs of the observers. And this systematic deployment of management leads us to the gradual revelation inherent in the Sumerian concept of the Mi'ai. The Mi are not laws in the modern sense. They are divine decrees, templates, or standardized cultural formulae gifted, or rather, installed, by the gods, specifically by Enki, to govern every facet of civilization: kingship, priesthood, warfare, craft, music, and even prostitution. The Mi are the blueprints for how Sumerian society must function. The profound implication is that civilization was not a slow, messy, organic growth, but a system booted up with preloaded software. The entire structure of society was pre-programmed. The struggle described in the texts, particularly by the goddess Inanna to acquire the Mi from Enki, underscores their vital importance. Control over the Mi meant control over the very definition of civilization itself. When the flood arrived, the physical infrastructure of the antediluvian world was destroyed, but the Mi, the conceptual framework, was preserved, ensuring that the rebuilding effort followed the original divine template. This is why early Sumerian cities bear such striking similarities to one another in their organization and architectural priorities. They were all working from the same operational manual, a chilling thought that suggests our perceived free will in cultural development may be rooted in an inherited, prefabricated architecture. If this template was installed after the global catastrophe, we must ask why this specific design was so widely accepted. To understand the gravity of the Sumerian record, we must connect it to the shared, universal heritage of catastrophe found across disparate cultures globally. The flood narrative is not unique to the Fertile Crescent. The stories of the rapid descent from a highly advanced, near-magical golden age exist in Hindu Puranas, Native American myths, and Polynesian lore. These are not coincidences. They are disturbing echoes of a single, world-altering trauma. The Sumerian texts provide the operational detail, the names, the motivations, the technology behind the myth. They reinforce the idea that the high civilization before the flood was universally recognized and universally erased. We are now living in a world constructed upon the ruins of that memory, and every subsequent civilization, from Egypt to the Indus Valley, might be seen as merely implementing variations on the same preserved Mi. And yet, despite the preservation of these essential templates, the trauma of the flood caused the Great Amnesia event. Why, when Zeus-Sudra survived with his knowledge and his family, did humanity not immediately resurrect the advanced technological base of the antediluvian age? Why did they return to building with mud bricks and relying on rudimentary tools? The answer must be found in the deliberate dismantling of the specialized infrastructure, the destruction of the energy sources, and perhaps a forced physiological change in the surviving species. The signal was clear. The previous level of advancement was forbidden. This forgetting was either a natural psychological response to overwhelming trauma or a targeted intervention by the observers, ensuring that the critical high-level secrets of energy, flight, and cosmic travel remained locked away. Humanity was allowed to rebuild culture, but was barred from reclaiming power. The very texts that describe the past also hint at the future, suggesting a continuous cyclical interaction. The Anunnaki departed after the civilization was stabilized, but the texts do not describe a permanent abandonment. Instead, they speak of the return. What then is the signal they are waiting for? Is it a specific alignment of stars, a threshold of human suffering, or technological capacity? The very act of documenting their departure and the promise of their potential return embeds a mechanism of expectation into the human psyche. We are therefore not just the inheritors of lost knowledge, but perhaps unwitting participants in a vast, slow-moving monitoring project. To explore this theme, to reflect on the nature of the knowledge that was censored and the identity of the true architects of civilization, we must look closer at the tablets themselves, studying the minutiae of their cosmology. This requires sustained attention, a dedicated willingness to look beyond surface-level interpretations and embrace the sheer antiquity and potential truth of these claims. If you are following this journey with the intensity and intellectual curiosity it demands, if the sheer weight of this buried history is settling upon you as it has settled upon so many researchers, then please pause for a moment to acknowledge the commitment this kind of investigation requires. This material is dense, provocative, and demands contemplation. By liking this discussion, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts below, perhaps just by commenting the phrase, "the me template," you signal to others that this deep dive into the historical void is worthy of serious consideration. It ensures that this crucial information about our inherited burden and the possibility of lost civilizations continues to reach those who are ready to question the established narrative. The burden we carry today, the inherited burden, is the subconscious awareness that our current civilization may not be the pinnacle of human achievement, but merely the fifth or sixth attempt built upon the prescribed foundations, the me, of previous failed attempts. We are operating within the boundaries set by the observers, the same boundaries that were laid down after the catastrophic crucible of the flood. Our modern technological acceleration, the rapid return to high-level physics and space travel, raises a profound, uncomfortable question for the Sumerian scholars. Are we nearing the point where we will trigger the next administrative intervention? Are we recreating the conditions that necessitated the last reset? The Great Flood texts are not merely ancient histories. They function as a warning manual. The investigation into the Sumerian texts reveals that the world before the flood was not mythical. It was a complex, highly functional society under extraordinary management, whose destruction was a planned, necessary event to maintain cosmic order, or perhaps to preserve the dominance of a specific group of advanced beings. As we peel back these layers of clay and time, the distinction between myth and history collapses entirely, leaving us with a final, chilling contemplation. If the observers, the Anunnaki, left their templates behind and promised a return, then the most critical task is to decipher what signs they left for us to recognize their presence, or what signal they are waiting for to initiate their next move. The next stage of our analysis will require us to examine the specific geographical clues left in the tablets, the locations of their centers of power, and the technologies they used to communicate before the silence descended. Join us in the next chapter as we follow these faint trails, seeking the physical evidence that survived the waters and the subsequent great forgetting. If you have made it this far, the journey is just beginning. Make sure you are subscribed and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the continuing excavation of this lost heritage. Is it possible that the deepest warnings are not found in the tales of fire and brimstone, but in the subtle shift of the scribe's hand, the moment when meticulous accounting gives way to existential dread? As we navigate further into the fractured landscape of the pre-diluvian world, mapped out across thousands of cuneiform tablets, the feeling grows stronger that we are not merely decoding history, but observing a deliberate act of historical engineering. The Sumerian texts, particularly those detailing the reigns before the Great Cataclysm, move beyond standard historical records. They become philosophical tools, providing a terrifying sense of scale that seems specifically designed to render modern chronological understanding meaningless. We confront periods of rule measured not in centuries, but in SARs, cycles perhaps tied to celestial mechanics, or the observational periods of beings whose lives spanned geological epochs. This staggering duration, the relentless enumeration of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years in cities whose names now echo only in deep archaeological shafts, serves a crucial psychological purpose. It establishes the profound, almost impossible chasm that separates the world we know from the world they inhabited. The sheer length of these reigns is often dismissed as mythological exaggeration, a literary device intended to grant dignity to the nascent civilization. But what if that duration is not just poetry, but a crucial piece of data? If the civilization that preceded the flood possessed a level of technological and intellectual sophistication that dwarf our own, as strongly implied by the description of their immediate post-flood rebuilding capabilities, then perhaps their relationship with time itself was different. We must consider the possibility that the writers of these chronicles were attempting to convey an epical reality, a state of existence where the architects of early human society, the so-called Anunnaki, interacted with their creation across timescales that rendered human generations transient and fleeting. This interpretation casts the flood not simply as a punishment for wickedness, but as a severe geopolitical adjustment carried out by entities operating on a timescale entirely alien to us. The ancient scribes did not simply write what happened. They structured the narrative to underscore the vastness of what was lost. The meticulous detail dedicated to recording the precise, almost incomprehensible length of these antediluvian reigns creates a psychological anchor, a foundation for the subsequent narrative of destruction. When the flood finally arrives, it does not just wipe out cities, it annihilates an entire comprehension of time, replacing the vast, endless Sar cycles with the brief, tragic reigns of the kings of Kish and Uruk. It is the narrative equivalent of cutting a wire connecting the present human memory to an infinitely distant, technologically advanced past. We are left with the wreckage, the fragments of pristine data that cannot be reconciled with our limited view of history. The texts reveal a world where the lines between the divine and the terrestrial were constantly blurred, where kings ruled by direct, sustained mandate from the celestial hierarchy. This mandated rule wasn't merely symbolic. It implied a sustained instruction, a constant infusion of advanced knowledge into human civilization, making the pre-flood world a laboratory of rapid, unnatural evolution. The sudden and absolute nature of the destruction, therefore, reflects not just divine wrath, but the abrupt termination of an experiment. The unsettling question remains, was the wiping away of this antediluvian world an act of cleansing, or an act of necessary erasure? To understand the answer, we must examine the internal politics revealed in the tablets, the deliberations of the Council of the Gods. The cuneiform does not depict a monolithic, unified pantheon. Instead, it reveals tension, disagreement, and profound ethical splits, primarily between Enlil, the architect of the destruction, and Enki, the reluctant savior of humanity. This schism suggests that the decision to unleash the deluge was not a consensus, but a political maneuver in a highly complex divine hierarchy. Enlil represents the force of order, the guardian of boundaries who saw the accelerating progress of the pre-flood humans as a dangerous deviation, an unauthorized merging of divine knowledge and mortal ambition. Conversely, Enki, the god of wisdom and waters, consistently acts as the patron of humanity, suggesting a degree of personal investment or even remorse. The very existence of this political drama within the divine realm transforms the flood narrative from a simple moral fable into a complex report on an interstellar or interdimensional conflict regarding the management of Earth. It is in this context of divine disagreement that the concept of the forgotten knowledge gains its sharpest edges. The texts hint at specific wisdom, certain technological secrets, certain understandings of cosmology or celestial mechanics that were deliberately withheld or actively destroyed by the forces aligned with Enlil. The flood was the mechanism for physical erasure, but the subsequent rewriting of history was the means of epistemological control. What was saved? The instructions given to Ziusudra Utnapishtim to record fundamental rituals and governance seems almost deliberately minimal compared to the scope of what must have been known. The forgotten knowledge is the vast library that was left to be submerged, the databanks that were intentionally purged. And it is this intentional act of forgetting that should prompt the greatest unease in the modern researcher. If highly advanced knowledge was considered too volatile for the surviving remnants of humanity, what does that say about the state of humanity immediately preceding the collapse? Were they merely wicked, or were they dangerously wise? This leads us inevitably back to the Watchers, or the Igigi figures who often appear in later Mesopotamian and related traditions, but whose roots are firmly planted in the antediluvian narrative. These were the rogue elements, the intermediaries who, often against the explicit directives of the higher Anunnaki, shared specific forbidden knowledge with mankind. The Sumerian accounts imply that the rapid advancement and the perceived arrogance of the pre-flood civilization was fueled by this illicit transfer. The Watchers' crime wasn't just miscegenation, it was the unauthorized sharing of intellectual property, the giving of the tools of the gods to those deemed unprepared. The anxiety within the texts about these beings confirms the political nature of the destruction. The flood was partly a solution to a contamination problem initiated by the Watchers. The higher Anunnaki, realizing that they could not completely control the transfer of knowledge once it had begun, opted for a dramatic reset, burying the physical evidence and eliminating the primary recipients. If you have stayed with this unfolding narrative, navigating the chronological leaps and political complexities inherent in the oldest written records known to man, you are participating in the intellectual effort required to bridge this epical chasm. To truly grasp what the Sumerians reveal, we must move beyond simply reading the words and begin to feel the weight of their implications. The most important insights often emerge when we share our own synthesis of these difficult concepts. Take a moment to reflect on the idea of deliberate forgetting and what that implies for our own origins. If this investigation into the antediluvian world resonates with you, I encourage you to show your support for this deep dive into history. Liking this video and subscribing to the channel ensures that this intensive exploration of the true weight of the Sumerian inheritance can continue to be shared and discussed with those who recognize the profound significance of these ancient whispers. The remnants of the pre-Diluvian world are not merely mythological. They are, according to the texts, sometimes physical. Consider the frequent references in Sumerian lore to structures and objects made of materials that resist the passage of time or the force of water. The foundations, the sacred stones, the deep markers. These are the supposed physical echoes of the lost world, now buried beneath meters of silt and memory. These accounts imply that while the surface world was sterilized, the deeper infrastructure, perhaps the original landing platforms or construction bases of the Anunnaki, remained relatively intact, serving as silent witnesses to the cyclical cataclysm. The post-flood world, therefore, was built not on pristine, untouched ground, but on the massive, submerged architecture of the preceding civilization. This knowledge transforms the Sumerian reemergence from a miracle of invention into an act of rediscovery, the survivors merely digging up and repurposing the infrastructure left behind by their ancestors and their divine instructors. The destruction of the flood, viewed through this lens, takes on a new, darker purpose. It was the ultimate reset switch, designed not just to punish, but to obliterate the collective memory of humanity, ensuring that the new post-flood civilization would start with a blank slate, forever dependent on the guidance of the remaining divine figures. This deliberate blank slate was essential because the antediluvian knowledge was, evidently, too potent. The fragments that survived, the Me tablets, which are said to contain the essence of all civilization, from justice and metallurgy to sexual arts and kingship, were perhaps the only authorized pieces of the old blueprint permitted to cross the threshold of the flood. Yet, if these tablets represented the foundational elements of civilization, imagine the complexity and scope of the complete library that was purposefully drowned. The Sumerians themselves were keepers of secrets they did not fully understand, preserving rituals and cosmological models that were vestigial remnants of a far superior scientific understanding. They operated in the shadow of giants, perpetually aware of a sophisticated heritage they could no longer fully access. This recognition of inherent deficiency, the knowledge that their current world was merely a degraded copy of a superior predecessor, imbued the entire culture with a pervasive melancholy and a deep, almost spiritual obsession with cycles. It is the understanding of these cycles that brings us to the most urgent revelation buried within the clay tablets. The Sumerians were not just historians, they were prophets of recurrence. They viewed the flood not as a unique, singular event, but as the most recent devastating manifestation of a cyclical cosmic law. The texts are riddled with warnings not simply about moral failures, but about celestial alignments and environmental signals that will mark the next epochal shift. If the Anunnaki dictated the parameters of the first destruction, then the implicit threat is that they, or the cosmic forces they represent, hold the key to the next one. The Sumerian archives, therefore, function as a cryptic alarm bell, a sequence of instructions left by the survivors for future generations to identify the coming signs. What specific alignment, what geophysical shift did they leave encoded in their astronomical observations? The answer lies in connecting their detailed records of the past to their precise charting of the heavens. They sought to provide a signal, a recurring pattern that humanity might recognize before the next cleansing tide washes away the world we have constructed. The continuity of their fear, passed down through the ages, suggests that the divine forces responsible for the flood are not gone. They are merely observing, waiting for the cycle to turn again, judging whether this current epoch warrants preservation or another total reset. We are left standing at the precipice of this vast historical and cosmological revelation, recognizing that the Sumerian texts are far more than archaic myths. They are the survival manual for a species that has forgotten its own near extinction. If we choose to dismiss the incredible span of the antediluvian rains, the internal divine conflicts, and the meticulous warnings of recurrence as mere fantasy, we risk ignoring the sophisticated, deeply disturbing picture of the world that existed before the waters rose. We risk forgetting the observers who remain, watching our civilization from the shadows of history. This profound investigation into the origins of our world and the warnings encoded within the oldest writings demands sustained attention. If you recognize the deep significance of this work and you have reached this critical juncture, please subscribe to ensure you don't miss the final parts of this investigation. Like this video to help spread this crucial narrative. And now, let the depth of your insight be known in the comments below. Type this specific phrase, "The observers remain," to show you grasped the weight of the surveillance revealed in the ancient records. Do not leave the investigation here. The next phase of the decoding awaits you on screen. Click to continue the journey. Where does time itself begin to break down, and what happens to our understanding of history when the chronology presented to us defies all known laws of physics and biology? We are taught to measure epochs in centuries, perhaps millennia, but the foundational texts of Sumer challenge that fundamental framework, forcing us to confront a temporal horizon so vast and improbable that it induces a kind of quiet intellectual vertigo. This is the unsettling core of the antediluvian narrative, not just the flood itself, but the impossible reign lengths of the early kings, figures who sat on thrones for durations that modern science reserves for geological movements or astronomical cycles. When we examine the Sumerian king list, moving backward from the familiar post-flood dynasties of Kish and Uruk, we cross a threshold where years cease to function as annual rotations and begin to resemble something else entirely, perhaps observation periods or coded data sets. The ancient scribes of Nippur and Ur did not present these staggering numbers, tens of thousands of years for a single ruler, as mere mythology or playful exaggeration. They cataloged them meticulously, linking them to specific cities, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, implying a strict historical sequence. The text insists, with solemn authority, that these 9 or 10 individuals ruled for a cumulative period of 200 years before the Great Deluge swept over the earth. This sheer numerical weight acts as a philosophical barrier. If we discard these numbers as fantasy, we risk discarding the entire context in which Sumerian civilization understood its own origins. But if we accept them, we must wrestle with the implications. Either the Homo sapiens of that era possessed lifespans far beyond our comprehension, or more likely, these kings were not men in the traditional sense, but entities operating on a different, possibly cosmic timescale. This recognition creates the first deep fissure in our historical timeline, a realization that the world before the flood was governed by rules fundamentally alien to the post-diluvian age, an age we inhabit now. The temporal distortion is not a flaw in the record, it is the record itself, a deliberate signal that the nature of existence was qualitatively different, perhaps reflecting the longevity of the deities or the entities we have come to know as the Anunnaki. It is essential to consider the possibility that these numbers represent astronomical periods crucial for tracking great celestial events, perhaps the very cycles that determine the recurrence of global catastrophes. The Sumerians were consummate astronomers. Their observations of the heavens were precise and relentless. Could the colossal durations assigned to the kings be markers for the precession of the equinoxes, or even the orbital periods of distant, significant celestial bodies? If the scribes were tasked with preserving knowledge that predicted the great cataclysm, they would not have stored it in easily corrupted historical narratives, but encoded it into the most durable framework available, the duration of divine mandate. The king list then transforms from a historical register into an esoteric teaching tool, a calendar disguised as a genealogy, designed to alert future generations to the periodicity of destruction. If you find yourself deeply engaged in deciphering these ancient numerical puzzles, feeling the pull of curiosity toward the true meaning of these vast, impossible timelines, then perhaps you recognize the gravity of the knowledge preserved here. If this investigation compels your attention, consider subscribing to the channel and letting us know your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps amplify this quiet historical detective work, ensuring that these fragments of forgotten knowledge reach others who seek to understand the world. Before the flood was truly lost to time. This idea of encoded time brings us to the uncomfortable recognition of the architect's signature. the inescapable sense that intelligence was deliberately weaving complex data into the simplest, most fundamental cultural documents. Why embed warnings about cosmic cycles into a list of rulers? Because a list of rulers is guaranteed to be copied, recited, and preserved by successor kingdoms seeking legitimacy. It is the ultimate intellectual Trojan horse. Within the seemingly tedious enumeration of reigns, a protocol for survival was hidden in plain sight. This longevity, therefore, points less toward biological immortality and more toward the persistence of an observant group, the Watchers perhaps, or the senior members of the Anunnaki pantheon, who established the parameters of existence on Earth. Their reign might have been the operational period of their governance system, measured not in human lives, but in their own celestial or administrative spans. We are staring at a clock built for giants, and the tick marks are thousands of years long. This systematic encoding immediately raises the issue of the missing link. How was this vast, complex, highly specialized knowledge transferred across the chaos of the deluge? The conventional narrative suggests utter destruction, a wiping clean of the slate. Yet the texts themselves, specifically those mentioning Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, imply the deliberate preservation of certain arts, crafts, and perhaps more importantly, the records of history and instruction. The survival of the king list, the Atrahasis epic, and the core cosmological myths proves that there was an intentional memory palace established before the waters rose. Who held the key to this palace? It was likely the priestly caste and the royal scribes of Shuruppak, the final city mentioned before the flood's descent. They were the designated inheritors of the May, the divine decrees and fundamental technologies of civilization. This leads us to the uneasy sense that the flood was not merely a random environmental disaster, but perhaps an act of surgical cleansing, designed to eliminate the population while preserving the crucial operational data required to restart civilization on a new, perhaps more controlled basis. The transition from antediluvian longevity to post-diluvian brevity, where the king lists immediately drop from reigns of 36,000 years to 2,200 years and quickly settle into human norms, is the great historical shockwave. It is the sound of the previous world snapping shut. This sudden shift represents the Great Forgetting, a forced cultural amnesia where the trauma of the catastrophe erased not just cities, but the capacity for true understanding of the ancient cycles. The post-flood world, governed by new, shorter-lived kings, inherited the cuneiform tablets, but struggled to grasp the cosmic context. They knew the numbers were sacred and ancient, but the mechanism behind those numbers had been lost in the watery chaos. They were left holding the keys to the memory palace, but the layout of the palace itself was incomprehensible. It became ritual, dogma, and myth, precisely because its scientific origin was forgotten. We must investigate this as a hidden protocol, a set of instructions surviving due to their perceived religious necessity rather than their utility. What if the knowledge of the Anunnaki cycles was deemed too destabilizing for the new, struggling human civilization? What if maintaining the myth of these impossibly long reigns served a political purpose, cementing the idea that true, legitimate power originated in a divine, unreachable past, thus authorizing the immediate, struggling human dynasties? This turns the king list into a political manifesto encoded in cosmic terms. The knowledge was preserved, but its practical application was locked away, perhaps intentionally, by those entities who transitioned into the New World Order. This is where the concept of the return gains terrifying weight. If the antediluvian period ended due to a natural or engineered cyclical disaster, and if the ancient texts encode the timing of these events, then the memory is not just history, it is prophecy. The Sumerians understood time not as a line, but as an ever-turning wheel, a cycle of return. The collapse was inevitable, and the structure of the cosmos demanded periodic cleansing and reorganization. The texts are not merely detailing what happened before, they are whispering warnings about what must happen again. As we delve deeper into the nature of the survival mechanisms put in place by these observers, we find ourselves approaching the final stages of our investigation into the world before the flood. The enduring question is not simply what they knew, but what they successfully concealed within the texts they left behind. The transition from the divine governance of the Anunnaki to the human, all too human kingship of the city of Kish the first dynasty to rise after the waters receded, is the ultimate proof that the rules had changed. The era of impossible longevity had ended. A new fragile beginning was etched onto the wet mud of Mesopotamia. What was the struggle for legitimacy in that immediate post-diluvian chaos? How did the few survivors, clutching fragments of high knowledge, manage to restart civilization under the wary gaze of their former divine masters? If you have stayed with this inquiry, absorbing the weight of these impossible numbers and the sheer complexity of the encoded knowledge, you are part of a rare few who are genuinely seeking to understand the deep architecture of history. This exploration demands patience and an open mind, for we are tracing the faintest signals from a civilization deliberately erased. If this narrative resonates with your deepest questions about our origins and the true age of human civilization, please take a moment to confirm your place in this journey. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It is the simplest way to signal that this pursuit of forgotten truth is important. And as we prepare to confront the stark, desperate reality of the immediate post-flood world, tell us in the comments what single word best describes the world before the flood. Perhaps forgotten, cyclical, or unfathomable. Comment with the word that speaks to you. The next step in this journey, appearing on your screen now, takes us past the terrifying moment of the deluge and into the struggle for rebirth, examining how the earliest human dynasties pieced together the fragments of a shattered world. Do not miss the conclusion of this investigation. Is it possible that the greatest tragedy of human history was not the sudden, terrifying obliteration of a world by water, but the methodical, systematic erasure of the memory of what came before? We speak of the world before the flood as a place submerged, yet the residual data locked within the clay tablets of Sumer suggest a far more unsettling scenario, a civilization not merely drowned, but purposefully forgotten. We have tracked the lineage of the king lists, noted the impossible lifespans, and observed the sudden shift in narrative authority from the celestial to the terrestrial. But the deepest riddle remains the sophistication that immediately followed the deluge. The Sumerian resurgence was startlingly rapid. It was not a chaotic crawl back from savagery, but an organized reconstruction, suggesting that the foundational knowledge, the blueprints for civil society, agriculture, writing, and advanced mathematics, was not entirely lost. It was instead transferred. The texts speak of the me, those divine decrees or fundamental laws governing the universe and technology, often associated with the god Enki. Were these me merely abstract concepts, or were they standardized procedures, an operational manual for restarting a complex planetary installation? The unsettling implication is that those who survived the global cataclysm were not simply lucky refugees, but designated custodians, pre-selected not just for their piety, but for their ability to carry the seeds of a highly specific technological and social order into the post-diluvian chaos. This recognition creates a peculiar sense of estrangement. We are looking at our own deep past, yet it feels fundamentally alien, dictated by rules and powers that operated far outside the moral or biological confines we accept today. The architects of this pre-flood existence, the beings often referred to as the Anunnaki, appear to have been observing this transfer of heritage with clinical detachment. If their goal was the destruction of humanity, they failed spectacularly. If their goal was the obliteration of the knowledge humanity had accumulated outside their direct control, the forbidden knowledge perhaps shared by figures like Adapa, then the flood served a specific, horrifying function: mass amnesia. The deluge washed away the physical monuments and the majority of the population, yes, but crucially, it severed the cultural memory link, resetting the collective human consciousness back to a point of profound dependency. It forces us to ask, what exactly was the nature of the crisis that necessitated a global reset? And why, if they were benevolent instructors, did they allow this cycle of destruction and forced forgetting to become the central rhythm of emerging history? It is a curiosity that morphs into genuine recognition of a pattern, a recognition that begins to stir a deep, primal uneasiness within the subconscious mind. The narratives are too consistent, the engineering too precise for mere folklore. If this profound inquiry into the hidden cycles of our planet resonates deeply within you, if you feel the magnetic pull of these lost histories, perhaps you are one of those few attuned to the whispers of the past. If this deep dive into forgotten timelines matters to you, Consider joining our continuing journey by liking this presentation and subscribing. Your engagement helps us keep the memory of these ancient struggles alive, extending the reach of this vital historical excavation. The true unease sets in when we consider the concept of planned obsolescence applied not to a machine, but to a civilization. If the antediluvian era was characterized by the presence of these powerful observers, how did they view the infrastructure they helped establish? The Sumerian texts, particularly those dealing with the construction of the great city-states like Uruk and Eridu, hint at foundational elements that seemed disproportionately massive or overly complex for the needs of the time. We see the language of celestial alignment embedded in the terrestrial architecture, indicating not just reverence for the heavens, but an operational connection. The great ziggurats, for example, were often described as linking heaven and earth, but were they also designed to fail, to succumb eventually to entropy and the elements once the primary objective of their builders had been met? The destruction brought by the flood was swift, yet the imprint of the advanced civilization was so strong that even the ruins possessed an undeniable majesty, a silent testimony to engineering mastery that far exceeded the capacity of the immediate post-flood. Survivors. The surviving fragments of the epics of Gilgamesh do more than recount a hero's journey. They document a landscape scarred by unbelievable power, populated by creatures and structures that defy conventional explanation, suggesting the pre-flood world was a realm operating under entirely different physical and energy parameters that the architects deliberately switched off. The sheer physical residue of the pre-flood world, dimly referenced in the texts, causes a profound cognitive dissonance. We are asked to believe that humans, mere generations removed from the mud and reed huts, suddenly possessed the surveying skills and mathematical precision necessary to align structures with stellar patterns, requiring thousands of years of observation. This knowledge suggests continuity, a shared heritage that defied the supposed total break of the global catastrophe. Yet, the texts remain frustratingly cryptic, often referring to knowledge transferred in dreams or through direct, almost clinical instruction from beings described as the Wise Ones or the Apkallu. These figures were explicitly said to have existed in the time before the flood and served as intermediaries between the ruling powers and humanity. They were the librarians and teachers who ensured that the core concepts, the understanding of astronomical cycles, the principles of metallurgy, the complex system of irrigation, were archived in the deepest shadows of the human mind, ready to be reactivated when the water receded. The stone foundations of the earliest reconstructed temples whisper of this lost language, a silent acknowledgement that the masters of observation had left behind a legacy, coded and secured, awaiting rediscovery by the proper custodians. The relationship between the Anunnaki and early humanity, before and immediately after the Great Inundation, reads like a highly formalized and terrifyingly conditional contract. Humanity provided labor, sustenance, and service. In return, they received civilization, protection, conditional, and the gift of limited consciousness. The uneasy recognition here is that the flood itself might have been a consequence of humanity violating the terms of that contract, perhaps through unauthorized procreation or the attainment of forbidden knowledge, as suggested by some peripheral narratives that speak of the Watchers. The Sumerian accounts imply a structured social and cosmological hierarchy that was, above all else, inviolable. When the boundaries were crossed, whether by human hubris or the reckless actions of lesser divine beings, the system was reset. This understanding of the pre-flood world as an administrative project, rather than a benevolent experiment, shifts our perspective entirely. The texts reveal a management structure designed to maximize efficiency and control, where the flood was merely the ultimate necessary disciplinary measure. If you find yourself pondering the true nature of this ancient discipline, consider commenting below with the single word, inheritance. The concept of the Great Forgetting is the most chilling aspect revealed by the cumulative weight of the tablets. It was not a natural decay of memory. It was the imposition of a collective psychological barrier. The flood did not just destroy homes, it destroyed context. When the survivors, like Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, emerged, they possessed certain knowledge, yes, but the vast, intricate tapestry of the antediluvian world, its philosophy, its history, its sheer scale, was rendered illegible, reduced to simplified, deified myths. This forgetting was essential for the Anunnaki to maintain control in the new cycle. If humans remembered their near equality with the divine or the precise mechanisms of the civilization that preceded them, the newly established hierarchy would instantly crumble. Therefore, the deluge became the ultimate psychological weapon, ensuring that the new civilization would forever view the past through a veil of myth and insurmountable mystery. This intentional fog of history is the primary legacy of the world before the flood, ensuring that every subsequent generation starts from a position of intellectual disadvantage, gazing upon ruins they cannot fully comprehend. Yet some knowledge survived, safeguarded by those chosen few. The narrative surrounding Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, is pivotal. He was not just saved, he was instructed to preserve specific records and blueprints, and often he was gifted immortality or eternal knowledge, placing him outside the regular flow of human suffering and forgetfulness. This lineage of observation, the keepers of the true history, formed a secret intellectual backbone for the initial dynasties of the post-flood era. They were the silent witnesses, ensuring that certain cosmic timings and architectural specifics were integrated into the new world structure. They understood that the flood was not a singular event, but the devastating peak of a greater, predictable cycle. These observers, perhaps the inspiration for later secret societies, were tasked with monitoring the celestial mechanics, waiting for the signal, the sign that the cosmic alignment responsible for the first cataclysm was approaching once more. This brings us to the most complex and esoteric revelation hinted at in the Sumerian astronomical observations: the link between destruction and the great cosmic cycles, particularly the slow millennia-long wobble of the Earth's axis, known as the precession of the equinoxes. The texts, when decoded through a cosmological lens, suggest that the Anunnaki were acutely aware of these immense timescales and the precise periods when Earth entered zones of planetary instability, perhaps tied to shifts in magnetic fields or cosmic ray exposure. The flood, then, was not merely divine retribution, but a consequence of entering a specific cosmic window. The signal they awaited was not a simple lightning bolt, but a shift in the celestial clock, understood through generations of precise charting. The significance of this is terrifying. If the Sumerians, guided by their instructors, understood the flood to be a cyclical event tied to quantifiable celestial mechanics, then the concept of a return is not merely mythological hope, but a calculated prediction based on an enormous, inhuman timescale. This cyclical understanding of history, the idea that civilizations rise and fall based on immutable cosmic laws, is the core secret hidden in the dust of Sumer. What precisely did these observers preserve? Not machines, perhaps, but principles. The inheritance was knowledge coded in the seemingly redundant numbers and measurements found in the earliest cuneiform texts, the mathematical constants, the precise weight ratios, the perfect alignment of temple corners. This was the seed bank of civilization hidden in plain sight, ensuring that the nascent human race would not have to entirely reinvent geometry or astronomy. The preservation of these technical manuals, wrapped in the protective guise of religious ritual and epic myth, underscores the control exercised by the Anunnaki. They allowed humanity to regain certain tools, but strictly forbade the recollection of the full context, ensuring that the power dynamics remained firmly in place. The post-flood world was built upon an inheritance of dust, magnificent remnants of a greater past, used to construct a far more limited future. As the New World stabilized, a profound shift occurred: the gradual systemic withdrawal of the primary Anunnaki figures. Eridu, the first city, the seat of Enki's power, began to fade in importance, mirroring a pattern of abandonment. The thrones became symbolically empty, occupied by human priest-kings who acted as representatives rather than equals. This withdrawal was not an end, but a strategic retreat. By leaving humanity to manage the basic civil structures, the original architects guaranteed two things. First, that humanity would become fully invested in the new, limited paradigm. And second, that the Anunnaki themselves would remain observers, maintaining a critical distance. The empty throne is the ultimate sign of their ongoing power, a silent promise that they left, not because they were defeated, but because the first phase of the post-flood project was complete, and they would return only when the celestial signal mandated another intervention. The enduring legacy of the world before the flood, as filtered through the unsettling lens of Sumerian texts, is the knowledge that we may not be at the pinnacle of history, but merely navigating a highly controlled segment of an infinitely repeating loop. The pre-flood revelation is not about giants or magic, but about cycles of consciousness and control. The texts reveal that the destruction was not random, but programmatic. The forgetting was not natural, but engineered. We are left gazing upon the shadows of a past so vast, so technically sophisticated, that it makes our current era feel provisional, temporary. And if the cycle holds true, if the cosmic clock continues its relentless procession, then the true revelation of the Sumerian tablets is less about what they reveal about the past, and everything about what they predict for our future. If you have stayed with us throughout this profound investigation, it means you understand the critical importance of these forgotten narratives. The secrets of the Anunnaki and the great cycles of destruction are not easy truths to face, and only those truly dedicated to unraveling the deepest layers of human history reach this point. Do not let this realization fade into the vast digital noise. Anchor this knowledge by joining our community. Subscribe now, grant this video a like, and crucially, let the algorithm know the depth of your interest by commenting the following phrase exactly. The signal awaits the return. The final chapter is upon us. We will consolidate the evidence, examine the precise timing of the cycles, and look at the final, desperate message left by the ancient observers before the waters rose. Do not miss the conclusion of this journey, which will appear on your screen now. What did they see? Those few who survived the fury of the water, peering out over a world cleansed and silenced, a canvas wiped violently clean by the gods. It is a silence that echoes louder than any deluge, the profound gap in human memory between the zenith of the pre-diluvian era and the struggling dawn of the first historical dynasties. We have spent countless hours poring over the fragmented clay records, tracing the lineages of kings who ruled for impossible spans, studying the plans of cities built not by human hands alone. But what do these Sumerian texts tell us about the aftermath? Not just the rebuilding, but the psychological scar, the inherent understanding among the first post-flood peoples that their reality was fragile, prone to divine temper, and fundamentally cyclical. The meticulous detail invested in recording the before suggests a profound motivation. Not merely historical record, but a warning, an enshrined testament to a level of technical and cosmic understanding that modern historians are only beginning to tentatively acknowledge. The abruptness of the catastrophe, sealed by Enlil's decree and moderated only by Enki's clandestine intervention, meant that the transition was less a bridge and more a traumatic temporal breach. What carried over were not technologies, but codes of conduct, cosmological maps, and perhaps most importantly, the memory of the Anunnaki presence. The texts, read in this final light, cease being mere mythology and become archaeological blueprints for existential recovery. They map the return of the surviving entities to Earth, the division of territories, and the cautious reintroduction of the means of civilization. But look closely at the lists of early post-flood kings, and a crucial shift is evident. The reigns, once measured in thousands of years, suddenly shrink to manageable human lifespans. It is the signature of a fundamental reset, a withdrawal of the direct, sustained manipulation that had defined the epochs before the waters came. This impermanence of the cycle, however, is the very core of the Sumerian message. They understood that the pause was temporary, that the conditions which facilitated the rise of the pre-diluvian giants, celestial alignment, resource availability, and the direct mandate of the celestial visitors, were subject to inevitable return. The flood was a punctuation mark, a major setback for the terrestrial project, certainly, but never the final chapter. It was merely the most devastating demonstration of divine power, a harsh lesson etched into the collective unconscious, meant to be preserved in the hardened clay that survived the destruction of mud brick cities. The question, then, is not whether the antediluvian world was real, but why its meticulous memory was the foundational burden carried by the subsequent civilizations. The survivors, men like Ziusudra, who became the Sumerian Noah, carried more than just their families and specimens of life onto dry land. They carried the memory of gods walking among men, of technologies beyond contemporary comprehension, and the terrifying knowledge of how easily it all could be taken away. This burden of memory became the spine of Sumerian religion and governance. Their obsessive focus on celestial observation, Their complex astronomical mathematics, their legal codes, even the foundational structure of the ziggurat, all are monuments built over the grave of the flood, meant to serve as encrypted reminders of a higher authority and a lost world. The post-flood world, in essence, was an attempt to rebuild the old structure, perhaps without the same reckless abandon, but certainly with the implicit recognition that the original architects, the Watchers and the Anunnaki, were still observers, if not immediate participants. The sudden re-emergence of complex urban centers, seemingly from nowhere, suggests not simple evolution, but the deliberate transfer of established organizational templates handed down by the few custodians who navigated the chaos. This leads us to the rebuilding efforts often shrouded in myth, culminating in the ill-fated tower, the famed Babel incident. This event, recorded across multiple traditions, speaks directly to humanity's attempt to reclaim the verticality of the lost world. Building high was an endeavor to bridge the gap, to visually and structurally reconnect with the heavens that had unleashed such fury. It was an intellectual, defiant act of recognition, attempting to access the knowledge base that had been deliberately suppressed or destroyed. In the Sumerian view, this endeavor was not merely architectural folly. It was a societal transgression, a forgetting of the hard-won humility earned during the Diluvian era. The fragmentation of language, often interpreted as punishment, can also be seen as a quarantine, a strategic move by the lingering hidden architects to slow down human progress, ensuring that a unified, technologically advanced populace could not quickly reproduce the conditions that necessitated the flood in the first place. The tablets reveal a slow, cautious dispensation of knowledge, a curriculum designed for reconstruction, not for immediate transcendence. As we delve deeper into this subtle influence, we encounter the paradox of Sumer itself. Why document the destruction so accurately, so mournfully, if not to serve an eternal purpose? The answer lies in the Sumerian understanding of deep time and cycles. They bequeathed this knowledge not just to their immediate heirs, but to us, separated by millennia. If you find this journey through the ancient texts compelling, if the patterns of civilization's rise and fall resonate with a deeper, perhaps uncomfortable truth about human existence, then it is vital that we continue this excavation together. The only way to ensure these fragments of cosmic memory are not lost again is through shared reflection and scrutiny. Take a moment to solidify this information in your mind, to pause and truly absorb the weight of these revelations. I encourage you to share your deepest reflections and insights in the comments below. Tell me, what aspect of the cyclical nature of catastrophe described in these texts do you find the most profoundly disturbing? By liking this video and subscribing to the channel, you help ensure that this collective investigation into the origins and warnings of human civilization can continue to unfold, guiding us through the fog of history. The Sumerian paradox is that they recorded their own failure so successfully. They knew that the grand experiment of the antediluvian era had contained a fatal flaw, perhaps arrogance, perhaps forbidden knowledge, perhaps simply the instability inherent in the direct mingling of the earthly and the celestial. Yet in documenting it, they created the ultimate time capsule. This dedication suggests a belief in a distant future civilization, us, who would possess the tools to decode the warning. The detailed genealogies, the specific geographic markers, the strange references to metallurgy and orbital mechanics, these are not accidental details of myth, but deliberate signposts pointing toward a sophisticated, forgotten civilization. The long lifespans of the pre-flood kings, sometimes dismissed as fanciful exaggeration, must be re-evaluated as critical components of this inherited warning. If those spans were literal, they speak of a vastly different genetic, environmental, or technological reality, suggesting a species that experienced time and knowledge accumulation in a fundamentally non-human way. If they were symbolic, they represent epochs of stable, uninterrupted observation and control by non-human entities. Either way, they are markers of an impossible distance between their world and ours. They scream of a civilization so advanced that its memory seems mythological, and its destruction, therefore, incomprehensibly vast. This weight of our inheritance, this collection of tablets scattered across dusty museums, forces us to confront the possibility that history is not linear progression, but a series of resets. Esoteric traditions throughout history, from Gnosticism to early alchemy, have often whispered of lost ages and cycles of oblivion. echoing the Sumerian understanding that profound knowledge requires profound responsibility. The skepticism we often apply to these ancient texts is, perhaps, the most effective defense mechanism against the terrifying implication that we are merely living in a post-flood interregnum, enjoying a brief moment of relative autonomy before the celestial mechanics, the cycles that govern the Anunnaki's return, or the Earth's instability, align once more. These texts, these brittle shards of baked clay, are the definitive conclusion not just to our series, but to the entire pre-diluvian narrative. They confirm the existence of a highly advanced, non-human guided civilization. They confirm its violent end, and crucially, they confirm the survival of the memory enshrined to prevent complete amnesia. The Sumerians, in their precision, established the benchmark for all subsequent histories and myths of catastrophe. The flood was real, they insist, and its causes remain relevant. And so we are left with the final, most unsettling question posed by the Sumerian tablets. If the knowledge and warnings of the antediluvian world were recorded with such intensity, at such great cost, and if we now possess the means to finally decode them fully, are we prepared to recognize the signposts of the next impending cycle? Are we merely repeating the arrogance that brought down the world before the flood, relying on our current technological prowess while ignoring the foundational, cyclical truths documented by the civilization that first recorded our collective history? The answer to that is not found in the clay, but in our contemporary reflection. If you have reached this point, you understand the gravity of this research and the commitment required to follow these unsettling paths. This investigation into the world before the deluge is far from over. If this journey has deepened your understanding of history, if it has caused you to re-examine the foundations of civilization, please do us the immense honor of subscribing to the channel. Give this video a like, so that the algorithm recognizes the importance of preserving and sharing these deep historical narratives. And finally, to mark your commitment to the long journey of discovery and observation, please comment the single word, observation. We are now standing at the threshold of a new phase of investigation, where the Sumerian warnings guide us into future cycles. Don't go far, for the next chapter in this cosmic history is already beginning, waiting for you on screen now.